I will just say this. Denmark can't even afford to defend Denmark itself. They don't pass the NATO report card. They don't contribute what NATO.
That's wrong.
That's not true,
That's
Carla.
actually wrong.
Well, I was the U.S. ambassador. I know about their capabilities. I know them intimately. I know their military. I know what they're able.
You just falsely said they aren't complying with NATO.
I don't know of any European ally that can actually defend themselves without the U.S. government.
If you thought Donald Trump trying to buy Greenland was a joke, you need to see this. His former ambassador just went on live TV to defend the plan, and it turned into a total disaster. She insults a key NATO ally, gets destroyed on the basic math by an expert, and then, in a moment you have to see to believe, accuses the people of Greenland of having Stockholm Syndrome. It is a masterclass in gaslighting. If you want to see a MAGA diplomat get reality checked in real time, show your support by hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and don't forget to ring that notification bell. Now, let's watch this together and I'll give my 2 cents at the end.
So let me introduce my expert panel. We're delighted to have Carla Sands. Carla was the US ambassador to Denmark under Donald Trump between 2017 and 2021. Carla, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. Thanks for talking about this.
Absolute pleasure. It's great to have you with us. You're obviously very close to this story. You were the American ambassador to Denmark. You're very close to Donald Trump as well. What is going on, do you think, in Donald Trump's mind as he started 2026?
Yeah, I think that this is an old story, actually, for President Trump, but he's the third U.S. president to have this concern. And there are 2 facts that nobody's really talking about. The first one is that Denmark, they're a great ally of the U.S. for 230 years, but they don't have the capacity to defend or develop Greenland. In other words, they can't afford this asset that they claim to own. And President Trump, like he said, is not, excuse me, this is my time.
Yeah, Scott,
okay,
hang on a minute. We'll just, Scott,
China or Russia take over Greenland. And those are the other 2 powers that would have the capacity to do this. Now, NATO charter. Article 5 is all of the NATO allies come to the defense of the other members. But Article 3, which comes before Article 5, is that every NATO ally has the power to defend themselves in their own territory. Denmark has never had the power to defend Greenland, cannot. And in this new order where we have the rising power of China, China's navy, China's military, and China's appetite for acquisition, their 2018 paper, China as a polar great power.
Okay.
President Trump is looking at this and saying they can't fulfill NATO Article 3 charter. They can't afford to defend or develop Greenland. Greenland is going independent. They'll go independent in the 21st century, just like Iceland left the Kingdom of Denmark in the 20th century and went independent.
So, Carla, I think lots of our listeners are messaging in saying,
Sure.
Isn't this the decision for the people of Greenland and Denmark? You may have those thoughts about how Greenland is run. America already has a base there. It has had historically a military presence, formerly a very strong military presence. There has been discussion about America potentially purchasing minerals or resources. Why is this language so aggressive from Donald Trump in the sense that we need to own Denmark? That's what a lot of my listeners are very confused about.
Well, President Trump doesn't want to own Denmark. Denmark is a country. Greenland. Okay, so Greenlanders have stated publicly and voted that they're going to go independent. They're going to do it in the 21st century. There's less than 60,000 people that live on a landmass that is 1/3 the size of the continental U.S. They can want to be independent. They can make their own laws, but they will never be able to defend themselves. And there are predators in the world like China, like Russia. We don't want them to fall into adversarial hands just off our northeast coast. It would be much worse than Cuba as a threat to the United States. So President Trump is looking at how do we secure the United States, but not just the U.S. It's for our allies in Europe and the UK as well.
Okay.
NATO is called North Atlantic. Greenland is the key to safe passage back and forth. And it's also important for missile warning for the West. And so Greenland must be secure. The U.S. can do it. Denmark cannot. And it's not our job to be mercenaries and help Denmark out with an asset they can't afford to own. So Greenlanders can be independent if they have a relationship with the U.S., like a COFA, like a free association agreement. They make their own laws, but they get investment from the U.S. and they get a security blanket that will make sure that they're protected. These are great people. They want to prosper.
But Carla, do they have a choice in this? And what you're saying, look, this is the deal that's done. This is what is going to happen. Do the people of Greenland have a choice in all of this?
Of course, Greenlanders have a voice in this, but here's the problem. Denmark has been gaslighting them. They now have like Stockholm Syndrome because Denmark has been saying, oh, America is bad ever since they got a whiff that President Trump thought that they couldn't secure Greenland. So they've been filling the minds of these poor Greenlanders with all kinds of terrible stories where it's been Denmark that's been the predators on Greenlanders. They've kidnapped the kids, they've sterilized the women, they kept them living until the U.S. military got there in the mid-20th century, largely in Stone Age conditions because they wouldn't let them have modern conveniences like rifles or kerosene lanterns.
Right, Carla, let's bring Scott in. Let's get some reaction because you've set out your stall. And it's good to hear the argument. We have a really clear argument. Sure. You're very close to Donald Trump. You've set out what's going through his mind.
I'm close to the situation, too.
Yes,
nobody knows the situation like I do.
Okay. Scott.
Yeah, I think it's always important, Aisha, to start off with facts and cut through misinformation. And I hope it is misinformation and not disinformation. And to make the general point, the specifics is that no reason to insult Denmark here. Denmark, as part of NATO, has been responsible for Greenland's defense. Denmark has cooperated with the United States under a 1951 treaty on Greenland's defense, including giving the United States exclusive military access to bases which they continue to maintain in Greenland. They had 17 at the height of the Cold War. They still have one base there. The United States can expand that base at any point that they want to. So it is untrue that Denmark is unable to protect Greenland. In fact, Denmark has met the 2% target of GDP for NATO members in 2023. And is going to increase to 3.3%, having allocated $2.3 billion for Arctic defense. Denmark
I just had to jump in and say Denmark can't.
Carla, hang on. You had your say. Let Scott have his say, and I'll come back to you, I promise. But let him have his say, Carla.
In fact, Denmark and the Nordic countries are far ahead of the United States in certain aspects of defense, such as icebreaker capacity. It is also untrue, whether it's misinformation or disinformation, that Russian and Chinese warships are around Greenland at this point and threatening it. There have been no recent threats by Russian or Chinese threats off the coast of Greenland, whereas there have been a number of threats of Russian and Chinese ships going into the U.S. economic zone off the coast of Alaska. But here's the fundamental point, and while this is all completely unnecessary, and why it is not motivated by any type of interest for Greenlanders or for Denmark or for NATO, that is, Denmark is not just simply solely protecting Greenland. That comes under NATO, which protects Greenland along with Denmark. And if the Trump administration genuinely had an interest over the defense of Greenland, they would be talking to NATO and consulting with NATO rather than trashing NATO.
Okay, Carla, come back to that.
I'm going to have to step away soon, but I will just say this. Denmark can't even afford to defend Denmark itself. They don't pass the NATO report card. They don't contribute what NATO.
That's wrong.
That's not true, Carla.
That's actually wrong.
Well, so I was the U.S. ambassador. I know about their capabilities. I know them intimately. I know their military. I know what they're able.
You just falsely said they aren't complying with NATO.
I don't know of any European ally that can actually defend themselves without the U.S. government, the U.S. military backing them up. That's just a fact. I'm sorry. NATO is the United States military with some helpers. And we want our allies in Europe to actually be capable. They're not yet. And Greenland, there's only 3 countries that could even defend it.
Okay.
Well, 2, China and the U.S. Russia, maybe, but I'm just not sure. But they do have great capabilities in icebreakers and in the Arctic.
Carla, just before you go, because I know you got to dash up, I just want to ask a question. One of our listeners has messaged in, Greg, and he says, listening to this lady, it sounds like the US has become the predator, and that is shameful.
Yeah.
What would you say to our listener, Carla?
Well, I would say that the US actually, if you just cut through all the noise and the legacy media that is gaslighting people, President Trump is looking at the Western Hemisphere and our transatlantic alliance and saying, how can we get it safe? Why do you think these countries are now paying 2%? Because President Trump pushed them to do it. There's no other reason, because he really pressed them. They would rather put the money into healthcare, free childcare, education, and not into their military. And I suspect that many of them will reduce their contributions after the Ukraine war ends.
Okay. And Carla, just before you go, do you think that America is going to take control of Greenland?
I think by the end of President Trump's term, Greenland will be more secure, and I'm not sure how he'll get it done, but I think it's exciting and it's moving very quickly this term.
Syndrome, falling in love with their captors simply because they prefer Denmark to a Trump buyout. That isn't diplomacy, that is delusion. She is rewriting history to justify a hostile takeover. And finally, that listener comment at the end, the US has become the predator. That is the real cost of this rhetoric. When you treat the world like a real estate deal, you don't look like a leader, you look like a shark. Scott Lucas tried to bring facts to the table, but as we saw, alternative facts are the only currency this administration seems to accept. So, what do you think? Was the listener right? Does this rhetoric make the US look like a predator or just foolish? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you hit that like button for more. Thanks for watching.